This video and all of its contents, including any opinions expressed by the narrator, are strictly for entertainment purposes only and is not intended in any way as a substitute for professional services and consultation from a licensed therapist, doctor, attorney, or other licensed professional service provider. Each person must make their own life decisions, and those decisions are theirs. Welcome back to Find Your Alpha. I'm back at you this week with another terrific video story, and the title of this one is Guy Walks In on His Newly Pregnant Wife in Their Bed with Her Ex, and she says, he won't let me explain and wants a divorce. Well, what did you expect? Now let's get into this story and see what it's all about. He starts off and he says, I met my wife in February of 21 and we married on the 18th of June of 2022. In December of 2022, we decided to try for a baby. She went off the pill and I stopped using condoms. Before you ask, it was my choice to wear condoms even though my wife was on the pill. I just wanted that extra protection in case of failure. Well, he's obviously a prepper. In May of 23, it was confirmed my wife was 9 weeks pregnant and we were both beyond excited, though a little nervous. In June of 23, an elderly neighbor of ours informed me that a guy around my age has been visiting our apartment several times a week in the morning before my wife went to work. Uh-oh. She works as an assistant manager at a regional fast food chain, and that's where I met her. The neighbor told me he'd been wrong before and knows when something isn't right. He told me to keep my eyes open and not tell anyone where I heard this from, as he didn't want to start trouble. Well, hats off to that neighbor for sticking his neck out. After finding out, I didn't immediately talk to my wife and instead decided to go talk to my dad the following day to get his opinions. He told me the situation sounded like what he went through with Mom. He caught her cheating with a family friend when I was 3 and my sister was a baby. They divorced and my dad got remarried the following year and Mom remarried 4 years later. Interestingly, she didn't marry the former family friend and blames him for breaking up the family. No, Mom, you're the one who broke up the family because guess what? You were married to this guy's father. Before you ask, yes, my sister and I belong to my dad. During the divorce, he had a paternity test done to confirm that. Now, getting back to my situation, Dad told me to have another discussion with the neighbor and have him call me the next time he sees the guy going in our apartment. I did that and the neighbor agreed to help me out. 2 weeks later, he calls me and tells me the guy just arrived and gives me a description of his vehicle and the license number. Where I work is only 15 minutes from the apartment, so I got in my car and sped home. On the way, I called Dad to let him know what was happening. He insists on coming over and meets me in the parking lot down from our apartment. Dad told me to be cool no matter what and he'd be there to make sure everything was all right. We both walk up to the door and I quietly open the lock and deadbolt with my key and silently enter. The light is on in our bedroom and we could hear noises. My dad grabs my arm and tells me to stay cool, but by this time my heart is beating up in my throat. Dad then takes out his Samsung and starts recording and we walk towards the bedroom door. When I hit the door, I burst in to see the ass of a naked man bouncing on top of my naked wife. I scream at them and the guy rolls off my wife and onto the floor. My wife then gets up and runs into the bathroom, leaving the dude begging for his life in front of us. Wow, what a scene. I go in to deliver a few blows on him, but my dad grabs me to hold me back, ripping my shirt in the process. I'm now up in the guy's face screaming at him to tell me who he is and show me his license. When he takes it out, my dad films it so we have a copy. The dude then tells me he was my wife's high school boyfriend and says if we let him go, he'll disappear and I'll never see him again. I asked him how long he'd been blanking my wife, and he just said this one time. Isn't that what they always say? I got up in his face and told him I didn't believe him because my neighbor has been seeing him coming here for the past 2 months. He then tells me he started coming over in February, which happened to be around the time of my wife got pregnant. Now this guy isn't using very good grammar here, but I think we understand what he's saying. After this, I tell him to get his things and get out. I let him know if I ever see him again, it will be the last time he sees another person. He scrambles for all his stuff, then runs out the sliding door and across the lawn behind our unit. That's probably the way he came in also, through that sliding door, but little did he know that the old man next door was watching him. After he leaves, I go over to the bathroom door and tell my wife to open up. She tells me she's not coming out until my dad leaves. I tell her he's not leaving and to come out, but she refuses. In frustration, I go to get something to open the lock, but my dad tells me not to and says, "Let's get out of here." I really didn't want to leave, but he insisted, so I grabbed a few things and we both leave the place with my wife still locked in the bathroom. As soon as I drive away, my wife calls me and starts telling me that this was all a mistake and that even though he'd been coming over for a couple months, today was the only time they did anything since she broke up with him in high school. I guarantee ever since he's been coming over, you two have been hooking up. I came to find out later her ex does something with racehorses and doesn't make a lot of money. He travels around from track to track and had been living in Florida before coming back here to work at the racetrack. So this guy sounds like a vagabond. She told me he reached out to her on Facebook and that's how things restarted, but I later learned she reached out to him first. What you're going to find out, guys, is in most of these cases, it's the woman who reaches out to the old boyfriend, not the other way around. I ended up hanging up on my wife and temporarily blocking her that night as I was so upset and couldn't think straight. When I got back to my dad's, I told him I needed a drink. He told me I wasn't going to drink as I needed to keep it together right now. Your dad is smart because he's been through this. Looking back, I'm sure glad he was with me that day, as I probably would have done away with the AP and then drunk myself to death. Yeah, those are two things you don't want to do. For the days and weeks that followed, my wife, her family, and friends were all ganging up on me, asking me to forgive her, stating she was carrying my child and to think about my family and my baby. I made it clear I was divorcing her no matter whose baby it was, as at that point I was convinced it wasn't mine, although she told me she had 100% confidence I was. She even offered to submit to a pre-birth paternity test, and her mom agreed to pay for it. Well, if she agreed to do that, then you should take her up on it. Now listen to this. He says, I refused. I told her regardless if the kid was mine or not, I would be divorcing her. I said after the child was born, I wanted a paternity test then. And if it was mine, I would have my full support. But if it wasn't, then it wasn't, and that would be it. So again, this guy has kind of sloppy grammar here, but I understand what he's saying. My dad even tried convincing me to have the pre-birth test done to get it over with and to put my mind at ease, but I didn't want to know, as if the child was mine, I might be persuaded to stick around with her, which I didn't want to do. So I think what he's saying here is he didn't want to know immediately, because if the child turned out to be his, he would be sucked back into that relationship. Whereas if he didn't know, he would just march forward with the divorce. I think that's what he's trying to convey, but he's not doing a very good job of explaining it. He says, TLDR, I filed for divorce and my wife contested it. At the initial hearing, she admitted to the judge that she cheated on me, but insisted with 100% surety that the child in her belly was mine, and through her attorney asked the judge to order a paternity test now to prove it. The judge asked my attorney if that would be agreeable to her client, and my attorney explained I didn't want that and told him the reason why. The judge looked at us like I was crazy, then asked my attorney, doesn't he want to know? My attorney told him I was willing to wait until after the birth to find out. The judge told us that was a first, then scheduled the next hearing for 2 months after the birth of the child. My attorney asked if this could be moved up, as the paternity would have no impact on my decision to divorce or not. The judge said he wasn't willing to do that, as sometimes things can work out with time. That's what you'll find in a lot of these cases. These judges try to do everything they can to get that couple to stick together. With that, he ended the hearing and dismissed us. Since then, my wife, her family, and our mutual friends have all been nagging me on trying to get me to stay in the marriage or at least talk to her. Even my mom joined in and asked me to think about it. She told me people can change and said she was living proof. She's told me many times over the years she always regretted what she did to Dad and has always been faithful to her second husband, who she's been married to for the past 24 years. Listen, if she was my mother and she did that, I wouldn't be taking any advice from her. He says, I've been headstrong and have held firm to my stance, thanks in no short part to my dad and my sister, who've been squarely on my side. Well, those are the people you should listen to. Now, here's what I'm wrestling with. Her due date is in 2 weeks. Everyone except my dad and sister think I should be present in the delivery room. I really don't want to be there, as I don't want to be around her and her family, but if it is my kid, I wouldn't want to miss that moment. Also, I'm concerned about what going through that with her will do to me emotionally. Feeling torn and unsure now and looking for answers, and that's the end of his original post. Now, I want you right now to think about, what would you do if you were in this guy's situation? Would you want to be in that delivery room, not knowing if that child is yours or not? Or would you wait till after it's born and then go get the testing done to see if it's yours? Think about that. And now we're going to take a look at some of the community comments he received. But before we do that, I want to remind you, if you like what you've heard so far, be sure to hit that like button right now. That will help out the channel tremendously and also help to get this video seen across the planet. Now let's take a look at those comments. The first one is from a woman. She says, judging by your wife's response, I'd say there's a 99% chance you are the father. We women know these things, and our OBGYNs can confirm the date through testing. As such, I recommend you be at the hospital with her regardless of how unpleasant that might be, as you'll regret it later. And the one thing I agree with this woman on is women know for sure when their conception date was. So they know with a very high degree of surety who that father is, even if they've been with multiple men. Unless they were with multiple men on the same day, and then in that case, it's totally up in the air. The next response is from a guy. He says, you should have taken your head out of your ass and gotten the paternity test done when she offered it, and you wouldn't be in this situation now. Since you can't go back and change that, I'd go and stay out in the waiting room away from her folks. Then right after the baby is born, they can do the swab and you'll know if it's yours within a day. He says, good luck to you. I hope things turn out like you want them to. The next response is from another woman. She says, keep an open mind and an open heart. You should go and be with your wife in the delivery room. The experience is truly remarkable and it will forever change both of you. If you do that, I predict you may change your mind on divorce, as the bundle of joy you created is something that will bond you forever. Best wishes to you and your wife. So this woman sounds like somebody with some experience here, and I wouldn't be too surprised if maybe she was a cheater too. And the last response is from a guy. He says, now listen to this one. This is a longer one. He says, reading this was painful, as I went through something like it back in the 90s with my first marriage. I caught her cheating and we divorced while she was still pregnant. As it turned out, I was the father. I didn't go to the hospital when she delivered, but went the following day for the testing. That's when I saw him for the first time and my heart exploded. My ex and I never got back together and eventually married other people, but I'm proud to say we raised our son right and never squabbled over things. He's 27 now and a fine young man. It's going to be difficult to put all the bitterness aside, but do it for your child and you'll be glad you did. And that sounds like good advice from someone who's gone through this. And now the OP comes back with his final update so we can see how everything turned out for him. And this update takes place 5 months later. He says, I want to thank everyone for your continued interest in my situation. I wasn't going to come back here as I didn't think anyone would care, but I've been surprised by how many have reached out asking for an update. I'm fully divorced now, and I'm also happy to report that I am the father of a healthy baby boy. So the kid was his. He says, I wasn't there for the birth, but did end up going later that day to see him and for the DNA test. As soon as I saw him, I knew he was mine, even though he was all red and wrinkled. His nose and his deep chin dimple are just like mine, and I knew even before the test confirmed it. Ever since then, I've spent time every day with him, either going over to my now former in-laws to see him, or the times I've taken him home to stay with me. On those days, one of my parents or my sister are usually with me as I'm still a little leery about taking care of him by myself, but I'm getting better. I'm super cautious about everything, and my parents have told me to just relax as he'll be fine. The divorce was both complicated and straightforward. Before the second hearing, my wife was begging me to stay, and her family and some of our mutual friends were pressuring. I will admit here that I thought about that long and hard, as it would have been so easy to do that, but in the end, I just couldn't after thinking things through. He says I'll never be able to forget what my ex did, and I'll never get the vision of her AP's ass and the sight of them naked together out of my head. To me, that's the first thing that comes to mind when I think of her. Yeah, I have to agree with you there. If I walked in on that and I saw that sight, that's the only thing I would think about when I thought about my ex-wife. He says, thankfully, during the divorce and so far after, my ex and her family have treated me respectfully and have not tried to keep me from seeing my child. That was my biggest fear, and so far, so good there. My next biggest fear is when she starts dating again, whether that is with her AP or someone else. It's not that I have any feelings for her, because I don't. I just worry about another man spending time with my child. And that's what I've heard from a number of guys who are divorced. That's one of their biggest fears is, once their wife gets with someone else or gets remarried, how that new partner of their wife is going to treat their child. And that would be a major concern. He says, I've read so many horror stories of how some kids get treated in these situations, and it worries me to death. I guess I'll have to cross that bridge when I come to it. I did offer it up to my ex that I would happily take full custody of our son if she ever wanted to make a fresh start with someone else. She refused and said she would never give him up and would never let him be treated poorly by anyone, which gave me a level of comfort hearing her say that last part. After the divorce, I sat down with my wife and let her spill her heart to me. She says she told me that the affair was a stupid mistake and that she would never make it again. We've all heard that before, haven't we? She said being married and having kids with me is what she wants, and she realizes how dumb she was. She said she got caught up in feelings of yesterday without realizing what she was risking and regrets everything now. Though I sort of believe her, I really don't care anymore now that we're divorced. The whole idea of her affair really doesn't faze me anymore, and I just see her as my son's mother. Well, that's good, because obviously this guy now has transitioned to a point to where he's indifferent. He doesn't really care one way or the other. He's moving on with life, and that's what you need to do. I know that having him means I will be tethered to this area for the next 20 years, but I wouldn't give him up for all the money in the world. It's funny, I'm almost in the same position as my dad was when he divorced mom. The only change is that I have just the one child when dad had my sister and I. He passed up so many career opportunities because he didn't want to move away from us. Even though my parents were divorced and we primarily lived with mom, we saw or talked to dad almost every day growing up. So it's obvious his father actually made a lot of sacrifices for him and his sister, which I have to tip my hat to him for doing that. He took care of his kids, and that's great. The OP goes on and he says, I've got 2 half siblings with my dad and 1 with my mom, and we all get along. And to their credit, neither of my parents ever made my sister and me feel less than at any time, even though they both started new lives. I give them both credit for that and will make sure to handle my situation the same way. So that's about it from here. I guess things turned out pretty well considering the circumstances, and I feel so much better now that I'm divorced. He says, I feel like a weight has been lifted from and I no longer feel disrespected and ashamed like I did when I was still married. So he either meant to say, I feel like a weight has been lifted from me, or I feel like a weight has been lifted from my shoulders, it sounds like, but again, he uses bad grammar here. As soon as I walked out of the courtroom that day, I immediately felt a sense of relief and strength that I haven't felt since the day I walked in on my ex and her AP. And that's the end of the story. And I thought this was a great story, and I thought the OP handled things pretty damn well. The only thing I question him on, and what I think he handled poorly, is the fact that he didn't take his ex up on getting that pre-birth paternity test. I think he should have done that. That way he would have knew early on that that was his kid, and he could have planned accordingly. Now, he didn't do that because he was concerned about getting sucked back into a relationship with this woman, and I can understand that, but I think it was stupid for him not to find out early on and then have to live with this doubt until he did eventually find out after the kid was born. So those are my thoughts there, and now I want to cover what I think are some of the morals of the story. The first one: a woman's ex-lovers are always a high risk for those predisposed to cheating. I've said this on other stories as well. You gotta watch out for those ex-lovers, especially if your girlfriend is one of these that's, let's say, kind of a free spirit. Next. The subject of DNA testing should be discussed before you get too serious with someone, so that way it doesn't come as a surprise when you request one. Now, in this situation, it was obvious. He caught this woman in bed with another man, but in those cases where, hey, there's not some suspicious activity and you still want to get one done, this is one way you can safeguard any kind of fallout that you might experience from requesting one. So just a little tip there. Next. Kids grow up and often repeat some of the same experiences as their parents. And you can see that here. He's following a very similar path as his father did. And you know what? He may be attracted to very similar women. When you grow up in that environment, you'd be surprised how much of that and how much of your parents rub off on you. And you end up repeating some of the same mistakes that they made. So your parents are very influential on your life. Next. Accepting a cheater will lead to a lifetime of mental anguish and a loss of self-respect. Thankfully, this guy stuck to his guns and he followed through on the divorce, even though he has an infant child with this woman, because if he didn't do that, he would be forever languishing with this mental anguish and it would just tear him apart. So I think he did the right thing there, even though it was very difficult. Next. Every child needs a strong father in their life. So when you have kids, you need to be there for them. You can't be a part-time dad. You can't be an absentee dad. You got to be active in their lives, especially in this modern society, because kids can easily go off track and go astray. And finally, in these kind of situations, 2 happy homes are better than 1 negative one. So it may sound like the right thing to do by sticking together, but if you're not happy in that environment, the kids are going to be aware of it. So what I say, it's best to go off and create 2 happy homes than it is to try to maintain 1 unhappy one. So those are my thoughts, and now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story, and how do you think this guy handled the situation? Would you have done what he did, or would you have done something completely different? Tell us about it in the comments. Also, be sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to this channel, and I will talk to you on the next one.